Welcome to the Disc Golf Doctor. Today we're going to be talking about preventing shoulder injuries. I'm sure it's something that many of you have dealt with or at least have concerns about. It's something we see in the clinic very, very often, and there's some very basic things you can do to start addressing it. Some of the factors we're going to go over may seem obvious to some. There's going to be some factors that I bet many of you haven't thought about. So let's get into it. Arguably one of the greatest factors for injuries in the shoulder is lack of motion in your thoracic spine. I made a video about that recently, and I'll include a link up here to watch that in more detail. It goes over exercises on how to improve the mobility there. But one clear reason why it's important to have good mobility in your shoulder can be demonstrated by altering your posture and moving your arm. If I slouch forward here in this position and I try to raise up my arm, that's all the motion I have. If I sit up taller, if I extend my thoracic spine, which naturally retracts my shoulders, brings them back, I have all this motion in my shoulder, and all I changed was my posture. Same thing goes for shoulder internal and external rotation, which are critical motions, particularly say if you're going to throw a forehand. If I'm going to throw a forehand, if I'm slouched forward in this position, that's all the external rotation I have. If I stand up a little bit straighter, I have all this extra external rotation. It allows my shoulder to move more, doesn't put the structures of my shoulder more at greater risk for injury. Because if I'm forward here in this position, I can only go so far, and I'm really trying to get my elbow out. I'm loading other structures in my shoulder much more so than if I were to be in a better position. I can naturally get back and keep the mechanics correct in the shoulder. So having sufficient thoracic mobility is very critical. That's one reason. There's multiple reasons why. I mean, part of it can be simply there's certain muscles that start in the thoracic spine that come and attach into the shoulder. It also has to do with, like we talked in the thoracic video, of that if the shoulders are rounded forward, that's going to put particularly the supraspinatus tendon of the rotator cuff at more potential to be impinged upon. There's lots of other issues that are related to that. But if I were to work with my patients who have shoulder injuries, and I had to pick one thing to work on, I might choose thoracic mobility. It depends on the patient, depends on your circumstance, but it's a very critical thing to address. The next factor we're going to talk about is having good rotator cuff strength. When you look at the structural anatomy of the shoulder, you have the head of the humerus and you have the glenoid, which is the socket. It's a portion of the scapula. And it's not like the hip joint where the socket almost encapsulates a good portion of the head, providing a lot of stability. In fact, it's the opposite. It's analogous to a golf ball sitting on a small golf tee. There's a much greater size of the head compared with the socket. And so it doesn't take a lot of motion of that head in relation to the socket to get to the point where it's out of position and therefore putting strain on other structures, particularly structures like the labrum or the supraspinatus tendon. So what provides direct stability within the glenohumeral joint, the shoulder joint? And predominantly that's the rotator cuff muscles. And very few people work specifically on those muscles. If you watch most guys in the gym, they're working the deltoid muscles here on the side, which really don't provide a lot of stability for the shoulder. The triceps, the biceps. You could argue biceps provide a little bit of stability in the shoulder, particularly the long head of the biceps, which does attach into the shoulder on the labrum. But it's really the rotator cuff muscles that are a lot more important, providing that dynamic stability. We'll show you a picture here of how all of the rotator cuff muscles are aligned in a similar plane, where it's all holding the head of the humerus directly into the socket and depressing it, not allowing it to glide up into the supraspinatus when we reach our arm up overhead or do dynamic motions. So working on those muscles are very critical. In my first video, we talked about some basic rotator cuff strengthening exercises, so I'll include a link here if you want to take a look at that to start on that. We'll work on some other exercises in the future, but that's a great starting point. The next factor on the list is working on dynamic stability of the scapula, working on the parascapular muscles. Scapula meaning shoulder blade, para meaning next to or around. So the muscles around the shoulder blade help provide a stable base for the shoulder joint to work off of. Like we referred to a moment ago, the glenoid is part of the shoulder blade. So it's one side of the shoulder joint, and the other side that the scapula attaches to is just the thoracic spine. It is almost floating on there. So the muscles are what hold it in place. It's not an actual typical joint you would think about. So unless those muscles are strong and naturally holding against the thoracic spine and properly moving it, you're going to have instability there and an incorrect functioning shoulder. Like we referred to a minute ago, because of that disparity in size of the head to the joint of the shoulder joint, it's a rather unstable joint to begin with. In fact, any joint is a balance between mobility and stability. Any joint that has less mobility is going to be inherently a stronger joint, like the hip joint, like suture joints where there's really no motion at all. Those are the most stable joints, whereas the shoulder moves more than any other joint in the body and therefore has the least stability. So not only do we have to work on stability of the glenohumeral joint, but also the scapulo-thoracic joint to help provide a stable base for the shoulder to work on. So what muscles do you focus on? See, a lot of people in the gym work on upper traps because they're muscles you can see in a lot of people, but it's not a muscle that's typically weak. The muscles that are typically weak are the serratus anterior and lower trap. Even though the lower trap is part of the whole trapezius muscle, those fibers are typically much weaker than the upper trap. And they're super important for the shoulder because they help with scapular upward rotation. As we go to lift up our arm or move our arm up, the scapula needs to rotate up along with that to get the shoulder in the correct position. So having those muscles not only stabilizes the scapula for the shoulder to work off of, but it also improves normal mechanics with throwing, definitely with overhead motion. If you're ever going to be throwing tomahawks, thumbers, stuff like that, you need to have good parascapular strength. And to go along with that, some people just look up in a book, what motion does the serratus anterior do? So in particular, people think, oh, well, it does protraction, which is this type of motion, the shoulder coming forward. It actively pushes forward. But in function, it doesn't actually do that. In function, like I said, it helps upwardly rotate the scapula. It helps hold the scapula up against the thoracic spine. And it stabilizes when you're doing other motions, particularly actually retraction. So even though it's the opposite motion of what it actively does, it's working most in those motions. So there's another video we talked about doing lawnmower pulls. That's an exercise that actually activates the serratus anterior a lot compared with something where you do pure protraction. Not that it's bad to do protraction, but it's not going to mimic everyday function, and it's not going to train the muscle in how to function when you go to throw and do fast, powerful movements. The last factor we're going to discuss is something most people wouldn't think about with the shoulder, and it is core strength. We've talked a lot about core strength in previous episodes, and it's absolutely critical for shoulder mechanics. You ask anyone who is really in depth with knowledge of throwing mechanics, particularly for overhead athletes, but really for any throwing athlete, and core strength will be high on their list to work on. If you don't stabilize your core, just like if you don't stabilize your scapula and your shoulder, you don't have a stable base to work off of. And inherently, if you have excessive movement somewhere, it's going to put extra strain on another structure. So yes, it's going to put strain on your back. It's definitely going to put strain on your shoulder. Because for example, if I go to throw the disc and I'm bracing properly and I use my core, I have a nice stable base and trunk for my arm to work off of. If I don't have that, then I'm twisting here. I'm using more of my arm to throw inherently. Even if I have decent form, but I'm not using my abdominal muscles, if I haven't strengthened them and trained them, they're not going to be stable, and it's inherently going to put strain on something else. Your body's really good at compensating and finding some other way to accomplish a task that you've asked it to do, but it's inherently going to put extra strain on a structure that's not designed to take that extra stress. So if you accidentally don't brace, you're using your abdominal muscles one time in a throw, you'll probably be fine. But if you do it over and over and over again, you're going to put more strain on the shoulder. So having good core strength is absolutely critical. Please see some of the other videos we've talked about core strength to get an idea of how to do that so you're not doing it incorrectly. I would say 9 out of 10 people we work with, maybe even more, do abdominal muscles incorrectly and have the wrong idea when they're working on them. So check that out so you have an idea of what you're doing. As kind of an aside, trying to determine which muscles to really focus on is interesting with disc golf. There's a lot of studies that have gone into throwing mechanics and what muscles to work on with overhead athletes and pitchers and things like that. And we can take some of that information, but some of our throwing mechanics are different or even the opposite of some of those sports, particularly backhand throwing. If you take a pitching motion, you're doing this. If you're taking disc golf, you're doing this. It's the opposite type of motion to a degree, not the exact opposite, but a lot of things are different. Some of the ideas we can take from particularly baseball research, is having not only the muscles again that are accomplishing the motion, but how do you decelerate the motion? Your arm just can't throw and then all of a sudden take extra strain. You need to be able to throw and decelerate your arm. So when you look at big muscle to strengthen for baseball pitchers, it's your external rotators of the shoulder. As you're throwing, you're decelerating that arm a little bit to control it so it's not out of control motion at the end. The external rotators are still really, really important to focus on for us disc golfers because it's a muscle that's characteristically weak in people, and having that muscle strong inherently adds stability to the shoulder. So by all means, we still want to really focus on that, but I would argue that shoulder internal rotators can be extremely important for disc golfers because as we're throwing, we're externally rotating to a degree as we're finishing the motion. Yes, absolutely, so a lot of it's going to be coming from horizontal abduction as we're coming out here. It's going to be rotating thoracic spine, but we are going to be rotating our arm into shoulder external rotation to a degree. And so the muscles that need to decelerate that would be the shoulder internal rotators. So those are going to be muscles we're going to want to work on specifically to train on doing a motion where we're externally rotating, but we're decelerating it using our internal rotators. So we're going to go over an exercise now trying to mimic that idea.
First exercise we're going to work on is going to target those external rotators we just mentioned. You're going to retract the shoulder by bringing the elbow up and then flipping the hand up. The nice advantage of this is that it not only engages those external rotators, but it forces you to engage those parascapular muscles at the same time. I'm pinching my shoulder blade here and I'm bringing my hand up. The mistake that a lot of people make is they let their elbow move into a different position so they can substitute different muscles instead of those external rotators that we're trying to strengthen. So I'm bringing my hand up. I'm going to do the reverse motion, keeping my elbow up and then letting the hand come down. Here's a simple way to use those internal rotators to decelerate as the shoulder goes into external rotation. So I'm bringing my hand in and then I'm controlling it on its way up. I could do this at multiple angles just like I could with the other exercise. A little bit lower does make sense. Higher up is great for things like baseball overhead throwing, but with disc golf, since we're keeping that disc a little bit lower, I think it makes sense to do it at a lower angle here. I don't have to go all the way forward because then the band becomes much more parallel with my arm and not really helpful. You could still work on the shoulder TheraBand exercises we did in the first video and just work on really controlling the arm as it comes back to the starting point. That's really the key here.
So thanks for joining us for the Disc Golf Doctor. Please leave comments, questions, ideas, thoughts. I'd love to hear from you guys. Don't take this list as the end-all and be-all. There's other factors that go into shoulder health and preventing injury. These are just four of the most important things that we see in the clinic and that also research tends to validate as well. Some future ideas coming down the pipeline and having to do with this is further rotator cuff strengthening, definitely further parascapular strengthening that we can incorporate into exercise routines going forward. Please subscribe and thanks for joining.